Welcome to the Deep Dive. Think of this as your rapid immersion into the essential knowledge on today's big topics. We sift through the information so you don't have to.
And today, we're focusing on trying to get some clarity on the Russia-Ukraine war. We'll be looking through the lens of Ben Shapiro's recent trip to Ukraine, and especially his interview with President Zelensky.
Exactly. Our main source here is excerpts from the Ben Shapiro YouTube video, the one titled My Journey to Ukraine and My Interview with Zelensky. So, the mission for you, our listener, is pretty straightforward. Pull out the most crucial bits about where the conflict stands now, those potential peace deals flying around, and, Zelensky's perspective on the key issues. Okay, so first off, Shapiro going into a war zone, what was the thinking there?
Well, his stated goal was really about grounding the conversation in facts for his audience, the Daily Wire members, trying to provide a deeper understanding beyond just the headlines, especially with something this significant globally.
Right, and the timing. It wasn't exactly a quiet period when he went, was it?
No, definitely not. The source material makes it pretty clear that Russia had intensified its air attacks right around then. There was that deadly strike in Kyiv mentioned. So, yeah, the danger level was high, which really highlights the seriousness of the situation he was stepping into.
Okay, and one of the big things in the air right now is this potential Trump peace deal.
Yeah.
What are the core pieces we need to understand about that?
So looking at the bigger picture, this deal, apparently discussed in London, involved some really significant potential concessions from Ukraine. The key terms talked about were Ukraine basically accepting Russia's annexation of Crimea.
That's the peninsula Russia took back in 2014, right?
Exactly, took unilaterally, which most of the world condemned. And also, Ukraine would have to acknowledge Russian control over large parts of eastern Ukraine, areas they've occupied since 2014 as well.
Wow, that's a major concession on territory.
Huge. And on top of that, the deal apparently said NATO membership for Ukraine was off the table. For Ukraine, NATO is obviously a key security goal. In exchange, the security guarantees offered seemed, well, limited, and it would mean a full end to sanctions on Russia.
So it really sounds like the scales were tipped heavily towards Russia in that proposal.
That seems like a fair reading, yeah. The imbalance is quite noticeable. And against that background, Zelensky's position makes more sense. He clearly rejected legally handing over Crimea. That's a fundamental point for Ukraine.
But he was open to something from Trump's side.
He did acknowledge the proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, and importantly, without preconditions.
But Putin didn't bite, did he?
No. The source stresses there's been zero indication Putin wants to de-escalate. Actually, right after Zelensky mentioned the ceasefire idea, Russian missile strikes continued, including those deadly ones in Kyiv and Lviv we mentioned earlier. It really begs the question about Russia's actual endgame here.
Yeah, that continued aggression seems like the main stumbling block.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, back in the U.S., you're seeing different signals, aren't you?
Right. What's happening there?
Well, the source mentions Vice President J.D. Vance suggesting there's a U.S. proposal out there, kind of pushing both sides to agree. And hinting the U.S. might, step back if a deal isn't made, suggests maybe a shift towards less U.S. involvement if things stay deadlocked.
And then there was Trump's reaction on Truth Social, directly criticizing Zelensky.
Yeah, that was striking. Trump really took aim at Zelensky for saying Ukraine wouldn't legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. He called that stance very harmful to the peace negotiations, said Crimea was lost years ago under Obama. He even claimed nobody's asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian, but then immediately mentioned Russia's major submarine bases there.
But that sounds contradictory.
It does, yeah. It really highlights how tangled and maybe conflicting the goals are in these talks. Trump's post basically put the blame on Zelensky for the war dragging on, suggesting Ukraine should just take a deal to cut its losses.
But the core issue remains Russia's actions.
That's what the source keeps coming back to. Without Russia stopping its aggression, any talk of a lasting peace feels, well, purely theoretical.
Okay, so we've got this complex mix. Proposed deals, Ukraine resisting, differing U.S. views. But Shapiro's trip was also about why Americans should care, right?
Exactly. The source really emphasizes how crucial it is that Ukraine didn't just collapse under the invasion. And it drives home the horrific human cost. We're talking tens of thousands dead on both sides, maybe 50,000 Ukrainian, potentially up to 200,000 Russian, according to the source, hundreds of thousands wounded.
Those numbers are just devastating.
They really are. And currently, Russia still controls eastern Ukraine and Crimea.
So Shapiro wanted to answer American questions.
Yeah, questions like, How are our tax dollars being used? What's the real situation with religious freedom there? What does Russia actually want? And fundamentally, what's driving Ukraine's fight for freedom?
The journey itself sounded pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. It vividly illustrates what it's like traveling into a war zone. The source talks about a long trip through Poland, a 10-hour drive to Kyiv, a deserted border crossing. Paints a real picture of the danger and disruption.
And he also connected it to the deep, often tragic, history of that region.
Definitely. Shapiro mentioned his own family roots in the area, linking it to Ukraine's long history of suffering. He brought up the Holodomor, Stalin's engineered famine, and the Nazi atrocities during World War II.
That Timothy Snyder quote he used.
Yeah, about Ukraine being the deadliest place in Europe, in the world during that period. More people were killed in Ukraine than anywhere else.
Just chilling.
It really is. And the history didn't stop there. The source touches on Soviet control, suppressing Ukrainian identity, then independence after the Cold War, and that crucial decision to give up nuclear weapons for security guarantees.
Guarantees that didn't exactly pan out.
No, they didn't. Then you have the more recent history leading up to this war.
The Maidan Revolution in 2014.
Exactly. Yanukovych pivoting away from the West, getting ousted. Russia's immediate response, grabbing Crimea, stirring up conflict in the Donbass.
And the full invasion in 2022. Some link it to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Yeah, the source mentions that timing, suggesting Putin might have felt emboldened. It's hard to believe now, but back then, many expected Ukraine to fall quickly.
But they didn't.
No, their resistance was incredible. They pushed Russia back from Kiev initially. But the war grinds on. The humanitarian crisis is immense. Something like 7 million Ukrainians have fled the country.
And those reports about children.
Deeply disturbing. Russia trying to Russify abducted Ukrainian children, changing their education, language, even forced adoptions. It's horrific.
Amidst all this, Shapiro also met with religious leaders.
Yes, with the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. Represents, I think, 15 different faiths. The focus was on religious freedom, traditional values. They discussed things with Zelensky, like maybe a ministry of family to boost birth rates, and the tricky issue of military deferments for clergy.
Okay, and then the main event. The interview with Zelensky himself. Shapiro described him as weary but upbeat.
Yeah, that was the observation. One of the first things they discussed was Zelensky's recent meeting in the Oval Office. He stressed the teamwork between the U.S. and Ukraine, mentioned positive meetings elsewhere, Saudi Arabia, France, one coming up in London. His main message seemed to be hope for continued U.S. influence, especially through sanctions on Russia, to help end the war.
And he was very clear about who started the war, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He really emphasized Ukraine's dignity and pushed back hard against any idea that Ukraine shared responsibility with Russia for starting it, positioned Russia clearly as the aggressor.
A big question for Americans is accountability for all the aid money. How did Zelensky respond to that?
That was definitely a key focus. He gave a pretty detailed answer, talked about U.S. and European inspectors being on the ground in Ukraine, overseeing how funds and equipment are used. He stressed transparency within Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, saying they've had open books from the start of the war.
So, basically an open invitation for audits all along.
That's what he stated, yeah. Said it was a deliberate move to fight Russian disinformation trying to undermine support. He also mentioned his own tracking, saying the roughly $104–105 billion in U.S. aid he's accounted for is mostly weapons and transport, not cash, going directly to Ukraine for logistics.
What about fears the aid is being misused or sold off?
He addressed that directly.
Yeah.
Said Ukrainian soldiers' pay and pensions come from Ukraine's budget, not U.S. aid. And crucially, he reported that audits haven't found any evidence of U.S. weapons being sold abroad illegally.
Okay. Then they kind of flipped it, talking about benefits for the U.S.
Right. That was an interesting angle. He argued the U.S. is gaining a lot from supporting Ukraine. Things like invaluable tech insights from seeing weapons used in real combat, better understanding of specs. He mentioned U.S. funding for drone development, shared intelligence.
And medical knowledge, too.
Yeah, transfer of battlefield medical know-how. Pointed out the lower wounded-to-killed ratio in the Ukrainian army compared to Russia's, partly thanks to that support.
And his final point framed Ukraine's importance in broader security terms.
Exactly. He basically called Ukraine a living shield for the civilized world, including NATO nations, against further Russian aggression. The implication being, if Russia advances further, American families might end up paying the direct cost of involvement later. So current support is preventative.
He also tackled those accusations about cracking down on religious freedom, specifically the Russian Orthodox Church branch in Ukraine.
Yes, he firmly denied those claims, emphasized his regular meetings with that all-Ukrainian Council of Churches, called it the largest in Europe, representing diverse faiths who are united for Ukraine.
United despite their differences.
That's what he stressed, yeah. Said they often present a unified front on big national issues. Regarding the Moscow-linked church, he clarified the issue isn't about faith or stopping worship. It's about the historical and allegedly ongoing influence of Russian intelligence services, like the KGB, over the Russian Orthodox Church leadership.
So he frames it as a national security issue, not religious persecution.
Right. That's the core distinction he made. Said legislative changes aim to stop Russian intelligence controlling the church in Ukraine, not to close churches or limit faith. He even threw in some history, mentioning Kyiv's St. Sophia Cathedral being older than Moscow's churches, kind of asserting the Ukrainian church's historical independence.
Lastly, the reports about forced conscription. How did he address that?
He acknowledged mobilization is happening because, well, there's a war on and it's under martial law according to their legislation, but he strongly emphasized the huge number of volunteers, citing figures between 600,000 and 800,000.
So not everyone is being forced.
That was his point. He did concede there might be isolated cases of corruption or coercion in the process, but he insisted these aren't widespread, systemic problems and that law enforcement is investigating and dealing with them.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive. We've touched on the complexities of that proposed peace deal, which seems skewed towards Russia.
Right, and Zelensky's firm stance on territory, but his openness to a ceasefire.
The staggering human cost of it all.
Yeah, and Zelensky's detailed defense regarding U.S. aid accountability and the religious freedom situation.
Some key takeaways for me were those specifics on the Trump deal, Zelensky's breakdown of where the U.S. aid actually goes, and that deep historical context. It really adds layers.
Definitely. Understanding that long history of struggle is pretty crucial.
And hopefully, for you listening, this has helped bring some clarity to a really complex situation without feeling totally overwhelming. So as we finish up, maybe a final thought to mull over. Considering everything we've discussed from the sources today, what do you think is the single biggest obstacle to a lasting peace in Ukraine? And what realistic role can outside countries like the U.S. actually play in tackling that obstacle? There are no easy answers, obviously.
No, definitely not. But it's something worth thinking about given the stakes involved, both geopolitically and most importantly for the people enduring this conflict.